He didn't even let her finish stepping down from the train. Walter Crane looked at Clara Whitmore the way a man looks at a horse he ordered and finds lame. A quick sweep from her worn boots to the fraying collar of her coat, and then he turned his back. Not slowly, not with the decency of hesitation. He simply turned, as though she were a door he had already decided not to open. "That's not the woman I sent for," he said to the station agent beside him, loud enough that the words carried across the platform. A woman nearby stopped fussing with her luggage. A man in a canvas coat looked over. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed. Clara stood with one foot still on the train step, her travel bag hanging from her hand, and she understood in that single moment what it felt like to be made into nothing in front of strangers. She stepped down anyway, because there was nowhere left to go back to. If you've ever been made to feel invisible in a room full of people, like you were the mistake, like your presence itself was an inconvenience, then you already know something about Clara Whitmore. And if you stay with her story to the very end, you'll understand why the worst moment of her life turned out to be the door that led her home. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that makes you feel something, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments so we can see how far this story has traveled. We never want you to miss what comes next. Now, back to Clara, standing alone on a platform in the Nevada cold, watching the man who was supposed to be her future walk away without looking back. The station at Harlow Creek was not much to look at in the best of seasons. In January, with a sky the color of old pewter pressing down on everything, it was the kind of place that reminded a person how small they were. The platform was raw lumber, still sticky with pine pitch in the summer months, now just cold and gray and splinter-prone. A single lantern hung from the eave of the station house, throwing a yellow circle of light that didn't reach far enough to do any real good. Clara set her bag down on the platform and looked at the space where Walter Crane had been standing. He was already at the far end now, talking to a man in a brown coat, gesturing once in her direction without turning around. The station agent, a thin man with a stained mustache, came over to her with the expression of someone who had witnessed this kind of thing before and still hadn't figured out what to say. "Ma'am," he started. "Don't," Clara said. Not rudely, just as a fact. He nodded and went back inside. She had been traveling for 11 days. She had eaten 2 proper meals in that time, the rest being whatever she could afford from station vendors between connections. A hard roll in Ohio, a cup of broth that was mostly hot water in Colorado, a handful of dried apricots from a woman on the train who had taken pity on her and asked no questions. Her dress had been washed once, in a washroom in Kansas City, and it had dried on her body over the following hours because she had nothing else to change into. She had a second dress in the bag at her feet, neatly folded, the better of the two, which she had been saving for the moment of arrival. She had not put it on. She had not wanted to arrive looking desperate. It hadn't mattered. She sat down on the edge of the platform bench, a narrow thing, warped in the middle, and looked at the mountains in the distance. They were enormous and indifferent. The wind coming off them had teeth. She pulled her coat tighter and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was very tired of being strong. It was not the rejection itself that had broken her. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she had not been in love with Walter Crane. She had never met him. She had exchanged 6 letters with him over 4 months, careful letters, measured, the kind of letters you write to a stranger you are hoping will become something more. He had seemed decent enough on paper. He had a ranch, 40 head of cattle, a need for a capable woman willing to work hard and build something. She had been capable once. She had wanted, badly, to be capable again. What broke her was the audience. There were 11 people on that platform when Walter Crane dismissed her. She had counted them afterward, the way a person counts things when their mind is looking for something to hold on to. 11 people who watched a woman be looked at and found wanting and left standing with her bag at her feet. That was the thing that had weight to it. The public nature of it. The being made into a lesson other people could carry home and tell over supper. She had been the subject of that kind of talk before. After the fire that took her mother and her younger brother 2 years ago, after she had pulled herself out of the wreckage of everything she had known and tried to put herself back together in a town that looked at her and saw only tragedy, she had become accustomed to being talked about. "Poor Clara," they said. As though poverty of spirit were the most accurate thing about her, as though what happened had reduced her to a single word they could say quietly to each other when she passed. She had left Pennsylvania because she could not breathe there anymore. Every street, every neighbor's face, every familiar smell in the market, all of it was layered over with grief so thick she couldn't see the ordinary world beneath it. The advertisement for mail-order brides going west had felt, at the time, less like opportunity and more like oxygen, like something that might let her fill her lungs again. Now she was here. The lantern above the station door swayed slightly in the wind. The last of the train's steam had dissipated into the cold air. The platform was emptying. Somewhere down the road, she heard the sound of a wagon pulling away. She did not know how long she sat there before the girl appeared. She heard her first small boots on the wooden platform, unhurried, and then a pause. Clara looked up, expecting to see the station agent's child or someone's granddaughter sent to fetch something from the building. Instead, she found herself looking at a girl who was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that had come half loose from its braid and a coat that was sized for someone slightly larger than her. The girl was looking at Clara with the direct, uncomplicated attention that children have before someone teaches them it's rude to stare. "You look cold," the girl said. "I am cold," Clara said. The girl considered this. "The bench has a crack in it," she said, pointing to the split in the wood beside Clara's leg. "Papa says it's been like that for 2 years, and nobody fixed it." "Your papa is right." The girl sat down on the bench on the other side of the crack, with the easy familiarity of someone who had never learned to be cautious around strangers. Up close, Claire could see that her eyes were dark brown and very serious, and that she had the face of a child who had spent time with sadness and was not particularly frightened of it. "I have a book," the girl said, producing it from inside her coat. It was a small thing, a collection of illustrated fairy stories, its cover scuffed and its spine repaired with a strip of cloth. "I can't read very much of it myself. Can you read?" Clara looked at the book, then at the girl. "What's your name?" she asked. "Lily Carter." A pause. "What's yours?" "Clara." Lily held the book out. "Can you read me a story?" It was such a small thing, such an ordinary, human, uncomplicated thing. And Clara found, to her own quiet shame, that it nearly undid her completely. That a child asking her to read a story was almost more than she could hold without breaking. She pressed her lips together and breathed carefully through her nose and took the book. "Which one?" she said when she trusted her voice again. Lily leaned over and pointed to a page near the middle. "That one. Papa skips over the hard words." "I won't skip the hard words." "Good," Lily said. "I like the hard words." Clara opened the book and started to read. She didn't know then that the reading would matter. She didn't think about it in terms of significance or turning points. She was just a cold, exhausted woman on a broken bench, reading to a child who had materialized out of nowhere, because it was something she could do. Because it was one small thing that did not require her to explain herself, or defend herself, or perform gratitude, or absorb pity. She had been a school teacher before. In a one-room schoolhouse outside of a small town in western Pennsylvania, she had spent 4 years reading to children, grading their compositions, teaching them that letters could be assembled into words, and words into ideas, and ideas into the beginnings of a life. She had loved that work with a steadiness she hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. The fire had taken that too, in a way. Not the schoolhouse. That had continued without her, but she had not been able to go back. Not with everything the town saw when they looked at her. So she read. She read clearly and slowly, giving the hard words their proper shape, and Lily sat close beside her and listened with the focused attention of a child who takes stories seriously. The wind was building. The cold was settling deeper. Clara kept reading. She was 3 pages in when she heard the boots. Not small boots this time. Heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man covering ground with purpose. She looked up and saw a figure coming from the direction of the stable, a man in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with the look of someone who worked outdoors in all seasons and had stopped arguing with the weather. He had dark eyes under the brim of a weathered hat, and those eyes were moving between Lily and Clara with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite anything else she could immediately name. "Lily," he said when he reached the edge of the platform. Papa, Lily said, not looking up from the book. She reads the hard words. The man, Clara understood this was Ethan Carter, Lily's father, whoever he was, looked at Clara with that same unreadable expression. She looked back. She was too tired for anything more complicated than direct. My name is Clara Whitmore, she said. I came in on the afternoon train. I'm not going to cause trouble, and I'll move along as soon as I've figured out where along is. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, more like recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. You're the woman Crane sent for, he said. It wasn't a question. In a town the size of Harlow Creek, she supposed, word moved faster than she did. I was, she said. He's changed his mind. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lily, who had finally looked up from the book with the expression of someone following a situation with close and careful interest. Storm's coming, he said to no one in particular. He looked back at Clara. Where are you planning to sleep tonight? I don't have a plan for that yet, she said honestly. He took the hat off and ran a hand through his hair and put it back on. There's no hotel. There's a boarding house, but Maud Tilson doesn't take in women traveling alone. She has a policy about it. He said the word policy the way people say a word they've been told to respect, but find privately idiotic. I see. I have a spare room, he said, then quickly. I mean it as an employment offer. I need someone who can help with Lily and with the house. It's cold work, and I can't pay much. But it's a room, and there's food, and it's better than sitting on a platform in what's about to be a serious piece of weather. Clara looked at him steadily. She had spent enough of her life taking charity, and she knew the shape of it, the slightly averted gaze, the careful arrangement of words to make the receiver feel less small. This didn't feel like that. He was looking directly at her, and his voice was level, and there was nothing in his manner that suggested he felt she owed him anything for the offer. I can cook, she said. I can clean. I was a school teacher for 4 years, so I can handle Lily's lessons. I'm not fragile, and I don't need to be managed. If you're offering honest work, I'll do honest work. Ethan nodded once. That's what I'm offering. Lily closed the book and slid off the bench. Can she come home with us, Papa? If she wants to, he said. Clara picked up her bag. The cold was serious now, the wind bending the dry grass at the edge of the platform flat. The lantern above the door swung in a wide arc. I want to, she said. She didn't say it gratefully. She said it the way a person states a practical decision, with the knowledge that it was the right thing and the private acknowledgement of how much it had cost her to still be someone who could make decisions at all. She had arrived in Nevada expecting a husband and a new beginning and had been turned out in front of strangers. She was leaving the platform in the company of a widower and his daughter, headed to a house she'd never seen, for work that hadn't been clearly defined. It was not what she had planned. But then, very little in the past 2 years had been what she planned. The wagon ride to the Carter Ranch took 40 minutes, and nobody said much. Lily sat between them on the bench seat and held the storybook on her lap. The road climbed gradually into the hills, away from the small clutch of buildings that made up Harlow Creek, and the landscape opened up around them in the way the Nevada landscape does. Vast and stark and particular, nothing decorative about it, just the cold facts of rock and sage and distance. Clara looked at it and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not comfort, exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of honesty in the land itself. It didn't pretend to be gentler than it was. She had lived for 2 years surrounded by people who kept trying to be kind in ways that required her to perform recovery for their benefit. The mountains in the distance didn't ask anything of her. The ranch house came into view as they rounded a bend, and Clara saw it clearly in the last thin light, a 2-story structure that had once been painted white and was now in that intermediate state between upkeep and abandonment. The kind of house where the bones were good, but the attention had been elsewhere for a while. A barn stood to the left, solid, well-maintained in the way that working structures get maintained when there isn't time or energy left over for the dwelling, fences that needed mending, a garden space that had been left unturned. She catalogued it the way she had learned to catalog things, practically, without judgment. These were problems with solutions. She understood problems with solutions. It was the other kind she had trouble with. Ethan pulled the wagon up and climbed down and held up a hand to help her. She took it. His grip was brief and businesslike. "Kitchen's through the back," he said. "I'll show you the room." Inside, the house was cold in the way of places that haven't been properly warmed in some time. There was a fireplace in the main room with ash in the grate that hadn't been cleared. The kitchen had dishes stacked to dry that hadn't been put away. A child's coat was on the floor near the door. On the table, a plate from what appeared to be last night's supper had been moved aside rather than washed. It was not a dirty house. It was a sad one. Clara knew the difference. Ethan showed her the spare room. Small, with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers and a window that looked out toward the eastern hills. And said there were extra blankets in the chest and the lamp needed oil, but there was oil on the shelf in the kitchen. He said it all in the tone of a man reciting information he was slightly embarrassed not to have organized better. "It's fine," Clara said. "It's more than fine." He nodded and said supper would be whatever he could put together, and she said she'd put something together if he showed her where things were kept. He seemed, briefly, uncertain how to respond to that, as if the offer surprised him, as if he'd forgotten what it looked like when someone offered to do a thing without it being a negotiation. "Pantry's off the kitchen," he said finally. "Whatever you find." She found cornmeal and a heel of salt pork and dried beans that had been soaking in a pot on the stove, probably since morning and then forgotten. She made a meal out of it, corn porridge with the pork cut fine and cooked through it, and the beans strained and salted and dressed with a little of the drippings from the pan. It was not elegant. It was food, warm and filling, and she set it on the table and called out that it was ready. Lily came in first and sat and looked at the bowl in front of her, and then looked up at Clara with an expression that was difficult to read. "Papa burns the porridge," she said. "I know," Clara said. "He left the pot on too high." Lily considered this. "He tries." "I can see that," Clara said, and she meant it without irony. Ethan came in and sat and looked at the table and looked at Clara and said nothing. He picked up his spoon and ate. After the first few bites, something in his posture changed, barely perceptibly, just a slight releasing of some tension around his shoulders. "It's good," he said. "It's simple," Clara said. They ate in the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable, the kind that comes from people who are tired and have found, briefly, that they do not need to perform anything for each other. The fire Ethan had lit in the main room was warming the kitchen now. The wind outside had picked up into the full storm it had been threatening, but inside there was light and food and the sound of a child eating without being told to finish. Clara looked at the table and the two people at it and thought, without letting herself attach too much to the thought, that it had been a very long time since she had sat somewhere that felt like it was held together by people rather than by expectations. She washed the dishes after supper. Lily dried them, badly, in the way of children who are genuinely trying. They did not talk much. But when Clara said goodnight and went to the spare room and lay down on the narrow bed with its extra blankets and listened to the storm make its considerable noise against the walls, she noticed that the thing she had been carrying since the train platform, that particular specific weight of being dismissed, had shifted slightly. Not gone, not resolved, just repositioned. She did not sleep easily. She lay in the dark and thought about the 11 people on the platform, and Walter Crane's turned back, and the long chain of events that had deposited her in a stranger's spare room on a January night in Nevada. She thought about her mother and her brother and the fire that had changed the shape of everything. She thought about the schoolroom in Pennsylvania and the faces of the children who had brought her apples and asked her the hard questions and trusted her with the parts of learning that felt frightening. She thought about Lily sitting beside her on the broken bench, holding out the storybook with the seriousness of someone offering something genuinely valuable. "I like the hard words," she had said. Clara pressed her fingers against the blanket above her and breathed. Outside, the storm did what storms do, thorough and indifferent and eventually finished. Inside the Carter house, the fire burned down slowly, and somewhere down the hall a child slept. And the man who had offered a stranger a room out of something that might have been practicality or might have been something he wasn't examining too closely, sat in the main room a while longer before going to bed. And Clara, in the narrow room with the window facing east, finally let herself close her eyes. She did not know yet what Victor Hale had set in motion. 3 states away, the moment he learned she was still alive. She did not know what was coming. For now, she only knew that she was warm, and that someone had asked her to read, and that she had answered. It was enough for one night. The first thing Clara noticed when she woke was the silence. Not complete silence. There was wind still working at the eaves, and somewhere outside a gate was knocking against its post in an irregular rhythm. But the storm had passed, and in its absence the house felt different. Stilled. The way a room feels after an argument is over, and the people in it are figuring out what they actually said. She lay still for a moment, long enough to remember where she was, and then she got up. The window showed her a world that had been rearranged overnight. Snow had come with the storm's tail end. Not deep, but enough to change the color of everything, to soften the angles of the fence posts and the roof of the barn and the long slope of the hill behind the house. The eastern sky was pale and flat, and gave no particular indication of what the day intended to do. Clara looked at it for a moment, then turned away and began to dress. The kitchen was cold. The fire had gone completely out sometime in the early hours, and the room had the stiff, indoor cold of a space that needed someone to attend to it. Clara found the wood box beside the stove, found that it held about half what it should, found the matches on the shelf where Ethan had pointed them out the night before. She had a fire going in the stove within 10 minutes. She was not fast about it. Her hands were clumsy from the cold. But she knew what she was doing, and she didn't waste effort on the parts she couldn't control. She put water on and found the coffee, which was low in the tin but sufficient, and stood at the stove warming her hands while the water heated. Through the window she could see the barn, could see that a lamp was already lit inside it. Ethan was up then. She supposed ranchers were always up before the sun. There was no version of that work that allowed for sleeping in. She had the coffee made and biscuits cut, and in the oven, using flour that was almost gone and lard and a scrape of baking powder, nothing fancy, by the time she heard boots on the back steps. Ethan came through the door with cold coming off him in waves and 2 chickens' worth of eggs in his hat, held carefully. He stopped when he saw the fire going and the coffee on the stove and the smell of something baking. His face did a complicated thing, gone through too fast for Clara to fully read. Then he set the eggs down on the counter. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. "You're paying me to run the house," Clara said. "That's what running the house looks like." He was quiet for a moment, pulling off his gloves. "I haven't been paying you anything yet. We didn't talk about a number." "We'll talk about it when I've been here long enough to know what the work actually is," she said. "Sit down. The coffee's hot." He sat. She poured and set the cup in front of him and went back to checking the biscuits. She heard him wrap both hands around the cup, the way a person does when the warmth matters more than the drinking, and something about that gesture, its plainness, its honesty, settled something in her. "Lily won't be up for another half hour," he said. "She sleeps like a stone in cold weather." "That's healthy," Clara said. "Children should sleep." A pause. "She took to you fast. She doesn't usually do that." Clara didn't respond immediately. She was taking the biscuits out, which required her full attention because the pan was uneven, and she'd learned in the first batch that the back heated faster than the front. When she set them on the counter and turned around, he was looking at her with that same expression from the night before, the one she hadn't been able to name. "She needed someone to read to her," Clara said. "I needed something to do. It wasn't complicated. Most things that look simple aren't." "Most things that look complicated aren't either," she said. She put the biscuits on the table and sat down across from him and poured herself a cup of coffee and held it the same way he was holding his, because she was also cold and the warmth also mattered. They sat for a moment without speaking. "How long had it been," Clara asked, "since the house had anyone running it?" Ethan looked at the table. 14 months, he said. "Since Margaret died." He said his wife's name the way people say the names of the dead, when they've said them enough times that the sharpest part of it has dulled, but the weight hasn't gone anywhere. Clara recognized it. She had said her mother's name and her brother's name enough times to know. "I'm sorry," she said, not as a formality, as a fact. "She got sick in the autumn and was gone by November," he said. "It went fast. I kept thinking it would slow down, and it didn't." He picked up a biscuit and looked at it for a moment as if deciding something. Lily doesn't talk about her much. I think she believes she's supposed to be finished being sad about it by now. Someone told her that, I think. I don't know who. Someone always tells children that, Clara said quietly. He ate the biscuit, chewed, swallowed, drank his coffee. These are good, he said. The flour's nearly gone. I'll get more on Friday when I go into town. The wood box is low too. He nodded. I know. I'll split more today. He looked at her sideways. You going to inventory everything that's wrong with the place? Eventually, she said. I thought I'd start with the things that are actually cold. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. Almost. It didn't quite make it, but it came close. The sound of small feet on the stairs announced Lily 10 minutes before Ethan had predicted, which said something about either his knowledge of his daughter's habits or the power of the smell of biscuits. She came into the kitchen still pulling her hair out of her face, her stockings uneven, one braid done and the other not started. She stopped when she saw Clara at the table, and something in her small face shifted into a particular kind of relief, the kind that Clara recognized as the expression of a child who had gone to sleep uncertain of what they'd find in the morning. You're still here, Lily said. I'm still here, Clara said. Lily sat down and pulled a biscuit toward herself. I thought maybe you'd leave in the night. People sometimes do that. Clara looked at the girl steadily. I don't leave in the night. Lily bit into the biscuit and chewed with the focused seriousness of someone for whom eating is practical rather than social. After a moment, she said without looking up, Papa burns everything. Lily, Ethan said. It's true, Lily said reasonably. You do. I know I do, he said. Lily looked at Clara. Can you teach me to make biscuits so I can make them when you're not here? The question was artless, the uncalculated directness of a child who has not yet learned to frame requests as less than they are. But Clara heard the thing underneath it, the contingency clause built into the asking. When you're not here, as though she expected the situation to be temporary, as though permanence was something she'd stopped assuming. Yes, Clara said. I'll teach you. Lily nodded and finished her biscuit and asked for another one and ate that too. Ethan drank 3 cups of coffee and didn't say much, but he didn't seem to need to. It was a quiet breakfast, but it wasn't empty quiet. It had the texture of something real in it. When Ethan pushed back his chair and put on his coat to go back out to the barn, he paused at the door. There's a list on the shelf in the front room, he said. Things that need doing inside. Margaret started it before she got sick, and I haven't... He stopped. Started again. I haven't touched it. If there's things on there you can handle, handle them. If there's things I need to know about, write them down and I'll look at it in the evening. He went out before she could answer. Clara found the list. It was written in a hand that was nothing like Ethan's. She could tell because there were 2 items added in a rougher, more pressured script that must have been his attempts to continue it. Margaret Carter had written in a small, careful hand, the letters even and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that comes from someone who learned penmanship from a teacher who considered it important. The list had been written in pencil on the inside of a flour sack that had been cut flat and smoothed. It was 17 items long. Repair curtain in east bedroom. Resole Lily's winter boots or order new. Check pantry for weevil in the cornmeal tin. Mend Ethan's work shirt left shoulder seam. Organize the attic so the winter things can be found. Fix latch on the cellar door. Clara stood there and read it twice. She was not a sentimental woman by nature. She had been once, maybe, before the fire, before the years of being careful with herself. But something about that list in that neat handwriting, the ordinary, urgent, domestic attention of it, the Risol Lily's boots, the fix the cellar latch, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief for a woman she'd never met and everything to do with recognition. A woman had stood in this house and written down everything that needed her attention, all the small, crucial things that kept a family from fraying, and then she had died before she could do any of them. And the house had been waiting. Clara folded the flour sack and put it in her apron pocket and began. She did not attempt everything in one day. She was not foolish about it, and she was not performing diligence for an audience. She worked through the morning on the things she could do without materials she didn't have. She found the weevils in the cornmeal tin and dealt with them. She mended the curtain with thread from the small sewing box she found in the chest at the foot of Margaret's bed. She sorted through the attic for 2 hours until she found the box of winter things: Lily's heavier coat, an extra set of blankets, 2 wool scarves, and brought them down. She found in the attic a box she wasn't looking for. It was small, wooden, with a clasp but no lock, and it had Margaret Carter's name written on a piece of paper tucked under the clasp. Clara set it aside without opening it. It was not hers to open. She carried the winter box downstairs and set Margaret's box on the shelf beside the stairs, where Ethan would see it, and she went back to work. At midday, she sat with Lily for 2 hours at the kitchen table, and they worked through the girls' sums, which Lily found boring and slightly offensive, and the first few pages of a primer that Ethan had ordered from somewhere and which had arrived too advanced for where Lily actually was. Clara assessed this quickly and set the primer aside and took a piece of paper and drew the alphabet in large, clear letters and began from there. "I already know the letters," Lily said, somewhat affronted. "Show me," Clara said. Lily showed her. She knew most of them. She was uncertain about G and Q and made them hesitantly, looking at Clara's face for confirmation. "All right," Clara said. "You know the letters. Now we're going to learn what they do when you put them together." Lily considered this. "Like how they make words?" "Like how they make words. I know some words." "You know some words by sight," Clara said. "That's different from knowing how to build them. I want you to be able to take apart any word you don't know and put it back together until it makes sense." Lily looked at her with those serious dark eyes. "Why?" "Because then no one can hand you something written down and have it mean nothing to you," Clara said. "Words on paper are just someone talking when they're not in the room. Once you can read them, you can hear anyone." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Even dead people?" Clara paused. "Even dead people." That landed somewhere in the girl's face, not with sadness, but with something more like relief, like a door opening onto a view she hadn't known existed. She looked down at the alphabet on the paper and traced her finger over the letters with a new quality of attention. They worked until Clara's voice started to go rough. She'd been talking for 2 hours. And then she called it finished for the day and told Lily to go outside for a while before supper, because children needed cold air and movement whether they thought they did or not. Lily went, without protest, which Clara suspected was less about obedience and more about genuine enthusiasm for the out-of-doors. Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched the girl cross the yard toward the fence at the back edge of the property, her coat now the proper winter one and properly buttoned, and felt something she didn't have a precise name for. It was adjacent to useful, adjacent to needed. Those were not things she had been particularly able to feel in the last 2 years, and they fit oddly now, like a pair of shoes she'd worn before but not recently. She was still standing at the window when she heard the wagon. Not Ethan. His horse was in the barn, and she'd have heard him bring it out. This was a different sound, the particular knock and roll of a vehicle coming up the road at a pace that said business, not leisure. Clara watched from the window as a small buggy came into the yard, and the man driving it climbed down with the brisk efficiency of someone who has a destination and is arriving at it. He was perhaps 50, with a neat coat that had been expensive once and was maintained carefully, and he had the particular bearing of a man who has spent a long time being the most important person in most of the rooms he enters. He looked at the house, and then at the barn, and then he walked toward the barn. A few minutes later, he came back out with Ethan, and the two of them stood in the yard talking. Clara could not hear them. She watched Ethan's posture, the way he stood when he didn't like what he was being told, but was keeping himself level. She recognized that posture. She had seen it on men who were being patient under pressure, men who were choosing their words because they couldn't choose the situation. After about 10 minutes, the man got back in his buggy and drove out the way he'd come. Ethan stood in the yard for a moment and looked at the gate, and then came in through the back door. He took his hat off and held it in both hands. "That was Dale Fitch," he said. Clara turned from the window. "Who is Dale Fitch?" "He owns the Fitch Land Company. Half the property in this valley either went through him or has a lien that goes through him." Ethan set his hat on the hook by the door. "He wants to buy me out. Has wanted to for 2 years. Says the water rights on the east side of my property make the whole parcel more valuable than I realize." "What did you tell him?" Same thing I always tell him. Ethan moved to the stove and poured himself water from the kettle. That I'm not selling. He didn't look pleased. Ethan glanced at her. You watched. I was standing at the window, Clara said simply. What does he usually do when you say no? Comes back in 3 months with the number higher. Ethan drank the water. 3 visits in 2 years. He's patient. Or persistent, Clara said. Those aren't the same thing. Ethan looked at her for a moment. No, he said slowly. They're not. He didn't say anything else about Fitch that evening, and Clara didn't press it. She made supper, a proper one, because she'd found a slab of bacon in the cellar, and there were still eggs from the morning, and they ate, the 3 of them, and Lily told her father about the letters and what they do when you put them together, demonstrating on a piece of paper with a pencil nub she'd appropriated from somewhere. Ethan watched his daughter explain phonics at the supper table with the expression of a man who is trying not to show how much the sight of something costs him. Clara saw it and looked away. Some things deserved their privacy. The weeks that followed had the quality of a thing being carefully assembled. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just steadily, piece by piece, the way a fence gets built or a field gets cleared. Clara worked through Margaret's list. She couldn't do everything. She needed materials she didn't have, and some of the items required Ethan's involvement. But she moved through it methodically, and the house responded the way houses respond to attention. Not with transformation, just with improvement. Warmth where there had been drafts. Order where there had been drift. Small dignities returned to spaces that had been functioning without them. She taught Lily every morning and most afternoons. The girl was sharp, which Clara had suspected from the start, the kind of sharp that shows itself sideways, in the questions a child asks when they think no one is paying close attention. Lily asked oblique questions. She wanted to know not just what things were, but why they were arranged the way they were, why the rules were the rules, whether the rules had always been the same, or whether someone had changed them once and could change them again. These were the questions that made Clara stay up some nights thinking about how to answer them accurately and without oversimplifying. She liked the work. She had not expected to like it as much as she did. She had expected to be grateful for it, which was different. Ethan gave her the agreed-upon wage at the end of the first month, a small amount, enough, and said nothing beyond the handing over of it. She took it without ceremony. They had found, in those weeks, a way of existing in proximity that didn't require much performance from either of them. They were not easy with each other, not in the way of people who have known each other long, but they were honest, which Clara had come to believe was rarer and worth more. There were difficult days. There was a Wednesday when Lily woke crying from a dream she wouldn't describe and wouldn't be comforted by her father, and finally, at past midnight, came and knocked on Clara's door and said only, "Can I sit in here?" Clara said yes, and pulled the blanket from the end of the bed, and Lily sat in the chair by the window wrapped in it, and eventually fell back asleep, and neither of them spoke about it in the morning. There was a Saturday when Clara went into Harlow Creek with Ethan to get the flour and whatever else was needed, and they passed Walter Crane on the main street. He looked at her with the brief, assessing look of a man who has discarded something and is mildly surprised to find it still present in his vicinity. Clara looked at him with nothing particular in her expression and kept walking. Ethan, who had seen the exchange, said nothing until they were in the general store. "That bother you?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "But not the way it would have a month ago." He nodded and went to talk to the man at the counter. She stood in the store and looked at the shelves and thought about the difference between a wound that's fresh and a wound that's beginning to close. They were both wounds. But the closing one, at least, you could move around in. Word had gotten out about Clara, as word does in small places. She was Ethan Carter's housekeeper, some people said. She was the woman Crane threw over, said others, with the particular relish people reserve for someone else's misfortune. She was the woman teaching the Carter girl to read, said a few, and these ones said it differently. With a kind of cautious respect, the kind that frontier people extend to work they recognize as necessary. One Sunday, a woman named Ruth Hadley came to the ranch. She was perhaps 60, wide across the middle, with the directness of someone who had long since stopped spending energy on social cushioning. She had brought a jar of preserved peaches. "I brought these for the girl," she said to Clara at the door. "I heard you're teaching her." "I am," Clara said. Her mother used to bring eggs to my place when my husband was sick, Ruth said. I never got around to doing something in return. I'm late, I know. But here. She held out the jar. They're good peaches. I put them up in August. Clara took the jar. Do you want to come in? I can't stay, Ruth said, but she didn't move immediately. She looked at Clara with an appraising look that was not unkind. You're doing all right out here? I'm doing well, Clara said. Crane's a fool, Ruth said plainly. Always has been. Ordered a woman like he'd order a plow, expected the same level of certainty about what he was getting. He's done it before, and the last woman was smarter than you and took the first stage back to Salt Lake. She paused. I mean that as a compliment. I understand, Clara said. Ruth looked at the house and back at Clara. Ethan Carter is a decent man, she said. He's been knocked sideways by his grief, but he's decent underneath it. You'd do well to know the difference between a man who's broken and a man who's just been hit hard. Clara held the jar of peaches and looked at the older woman steadily. I know the difference. Ruth gave a small nod. Good, she said, and went back to her horse. Clara stood in the doorway a moment after she'd gone and turned the jar in her hands. She looked at the amber color of the peaches through the glass, preserved from August, from the summer past, put up against the winter by someone who had thought ahead and done the work. She thought about the list in Margaret Carter's handwriting. She thought about Lily asking about dead people and letters and what words can do when you know how to put them together. She went back inside. Ethan was at the table with a ledger and a look on his face that she had come to recognize as the look of a man doing sums he didn't like. He looked up when she came in. Ruth Hadley, Clara said, setting the peaches on the counter. He looked at the jar. Something crossed his face. She came by. She brought them for Lily, said she owed Margaret. Ethan looked at the jar for a long moment. She's a good woman, Ruth. I liked her, Clara said honestly. He looked back at the ledger and then closed it in the way of a man who has looked at something long enough. I wanted to ask you something, he said. Clara sat down at the table. All right. You were a school teacher, he said, back in Pennsylvania. 4 years. Why'd you stop? Before all of it. What made you decide to come west as a... He stopped, recalibrating his words. It's your business. I'm not trying to pry. It's not prying, Clara said. I stopped because everything that was familiar became unbearable. I thought distance would fix it. I'm not sure distance fixes anything, but sometimes it gives you enough room to breathe until you can fix it yourself. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. That's honest. I'm generally honest, she said. It's less work than the alternative. He almost smiled again. It almost made it. I wanted to ask if you're willing to take on more with Lily's schooling. There's a school in Harlow Creek, but the teacher left in October and they haven't replaced him. Some families are sending their children to Prescott, which is 40 miles. Others are just not sending them. He paused. Lily should have more than what I can give her. I know that. I just didn't know how to get it until you were here. Clara looked at him. You want me to formally take on her education? More systematically, yes. I'll pay you additionally for the time. You're already paying me, she said. It's more work. It's work I'm doing anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then let me pay you more anyway, he said with a stubbornness that was so genuine it almost made her smile. Let me do that. She looked at him across the table. This man who was not broken, just hit hard, as Ruth had said, who put logs on the fire at 6 in the morning and kept his daughter's coat properly buttoned and did his sums in a ledger with the expression of someone who intended to keep his land, no matter what Dale Fitch offered for it. All right, she said. You can pay me more. He nodded once. The matter was settled. That night, after Lily was in bed and the house was quiet, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific. She had almost no one left to write to. She wrote it to herself the way she had sometimes done in the bad months after the fire, as a way of taking account. I have been in Nevada 5 weeks, she wrote. I have not been warm enough, but I have been warm. I have been lonely in the old way, the way I carry with me, but I have not been alone. The girl is good and sharp and sad in the way of children who have learned too early that things end, The man is quiet and honest and doing his best with the parts of his life that are still working. She stopped there, looked at what she'd written, then added, I think I might be all right here. I am trying not to say that too loudly yet. She folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her dress. Outside, the Nevada dark was absolute and cold and enormous. The lamp on the table made its small circle of light. She was sitting in it, and for now, that was enough. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 3 days earlier, in a town called Reno, a man had stepped off a train and made an inquiry at the station about a woman named Clara Whitmore, and the station agent had said yes, he thought he'd seen a woman by that name. And the man had thanked him and smiled the particular smile of someone who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just been told it is near. His name was Victor Hale, and the thing he had spent 2 years looking for was Clara. He came on a Tuesday, which was laundry day, which meant Clara was in the yard when she first saw him. She had her arms in the wash basin and her back to the road when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the drive at the unhurried pace of someone who is not lost and not in a hurry and has no reason to be either. She straightened and turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw the man on the gray horse and felt something happen in her chest that she could not immediately name. She named it 3 seconds later when he got close enough for her to see his face. It was a physical thing, the recognition, not just mental. Her body knew him before her mind had fully assembled the information, the way a body knows heat before it decides to move away from it. Her hand stopped moving against the apron fabric. Her breathing went shallow without her telling it to. Every instinct she had, every animal thing underneath the thinking, said, "This is the thing that has been hunting you." Victor Hale had not changed much in 2 years. He was 43, perhaps 44 now, with a face that had always been arranged pleasantly enough to pass as trustworthy at a first meeting and a second and sometimes a third. He was well dressed for a man arriving at a working ranch, a good wool coat, clean boots, his hat the kind that costs what a laborer makes in a week. He smiled as he approached, and the smile was the same one she remembered, wide and deliberate, and reaching no further than his mouth. "Clara," he said, pulling up the horse. "I've been looking for you." She said nothing. 2 years, he said, in the tone of a man remarking on an inconvenience rather than a search. "That's a long time to travel." He looked at the wash basin and the clothesline and the house behind her. "You've done well for yourself out here. A rancher's... what? Housekeeper?" "What do you want, Victor?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. She was distantly grateful for that. "I want to talk," he said. "That's all. I've come a long way to talk." "You came a long way the last time, too," she said, "when you burned my family's house down." His expression didn't change. That was the thing about Victor Hale. His face was something he operated rather than something that told the truth about him. "That's a serious accusation," he said pleasantly, "and I believe the official finding was accidental fire. Faulty stove. You were there. You know what they said." "I know what I saw," Clara said. "Clara." He swung down from the horse, which was what she'd been afraid he'd do, because it changed the geometry of the situation, put him on her level and closer. She took one step back without meaning to, and hated herself for it. "You've been carrying this story around with you for 2 years, and it hasn't done you any good. Look at you, out here in the middle of nowhere, washing someone else's clothes. Is this the life you wanted?" "Yes," she said flatly. "It is." Something moved in his eyes. Not anger. Not yet. Something more like recalibration. He had expected, she understood, a different version of her. The one from 2 years ago, the one who had been so destroyed by grief and shock that she'd barely been able to string together a sentence when the investigators came asking. He had expected fear that would make her compliant, exhaustion that would make her doubting, isolation that would make her feel she had no options. He had not expected this. "I need you to sign something," he said. The pleasantness in his voice dropped a register, became something more businesslike. A statement, confirming that what happened in Claremont was an accident, that you misremember the details. You were in shock, it was dark, you were grieving. All of that is true, Clara. Juries understand that. People misremember things in trauma. "I didn't misremember anything," she said. "The land is being transferred, but," he said, "your family's land in Claremont. I have a buyer and we are very close to completing the transaction." Your testimony, even the possibility of your testimony, is the only thing that complicates it. Sign the statement, Clara. I'll pay you for it. Enough to... He looked at the wash basin again. Enough to do better than this. Get off this property, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll come back, he said. Think about it. There's nothing to think about. Think about it anyway, he said, and put his foot back in the stirrup, and was gone back down the road with the same unhurried pace he'd arrived with. Clara stood in the yard until the sound of the horse disappeared, and then she sat down on the edge of the water trough because her legs had decided they were finished standing. She sat there for a few minutes, her hands pressed flat on her thighs, and breathed. Then she got up and finished the laundry. She had learned, in the 2 years since the fire, that the body's work is the most reliable thing available when the mind is in chaos. Wring the shirt, hang it on the line, smooth the fabric so it dries without too many wrinkles. These were true things. They had edges and weight and outcomes. She held on to them until she was steady enough to think. She was taking the last items from the basket when she heard boots behind her and turned to find Ethan coming from the direction of the fence line. A post driver over one shoulder, his hat pushed back on his head the way it got when he'd been working hard in cold air. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She told him. All of it. Not the edited version, not the version she had been carrying around for 2 years told in pieces to no one. The complete thing. The fire, her mother and brother, the official finding of accident, her own testimony that no one had believed or acted on because Victor Hale had been in Claremont for 30 years and owned property adjacent to half the county and sat on the land assessment board. The fact that he wanted her family's land because of the water rights running through the eastern portion of it. The fact that with her mother and brother gone, and Clara having no documentation, no deed in her own name, no legal standing, the land was effectively uncontested. Ethan stood and listened. He had set the post driver down. He didn't interrupt, didn't shift his weight with impatience, didn't offer reassurances in the middle of the telling. He just listened, with the complete attention of a man who understands that some things need to be said in full before they can be responded to. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He came here," Ethan said. "To this property?" "Yes." "Asking you to sign a statement?" "Yes." He looked at the road where the gray horse had gone. "He'll be staying somewhere in Harlow Creek. There are only 2 places, the boarding house or the hotel on 2nd Street. He paused. "He'll come back." "I know," Clara said. "When he does," Ethan said, "he needs to find that you are not alone here and that the people around you know what he is." He looked at her directly. "We should go see the sheriff." Clara looked back at him. She had been to a sheriff before. She had sat across a desk from a man who was polite and thorough and ultimately told her that without physical evidence or eyewitness corroboration, there was nothing he could do about an official finding of accidental fire. She had left that office in Claremont understanding that the official version of events had more infrastructure than the truth. "I tried that," she said. "You tried it alone, in a place where he had 30 years of relationships, and you had a grief-damaged reputation and no documentation," Ethan said, not unkindly. "This is different." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. Not with suspicion, genuinely. "This isn't your trouble." "You're on my property," he said. "That makes it my trouble by default." He picked up the post driver. "And you've been here 6 weeks and you've fixed half of what was wrong with this house. And my daughter is reading actual sentences now, and you make better coffee than anyone in this county." He paused. "I'm not inclined to let a man like that come onto my land and frighten someone who works for me." It was not a declaration of anything. It was stated in the same practical, unembellished tone he used for most things. Clara recognized it for what it was, not a rescue, not a grand gesture, just a man telling her clearly that she was not alone. And something in her that had been held very tight for a long time released slightly. "All right," she said. "We'll go see the sheriff." They went the following morning. Lily stayed with Ruth Hadley, who received this information with the no-questions efficiency of a woman who has lived long enough to know when a situation doesn't require explanation. Ethan drove the wagon, and Clara sat beside him and gave him the rest of the details on the way. The name of the sheriff in Claremont she'd spoken to, the name of the buyer Victor had mentioned, the specific nature of the land and the water rights. Sheriff Tom Ardell was a man of perhaps 55 with a face weathered to the consistency of old saddle leather and the manner of someone who distinguishes between problems that are his to solve and problems that aren't, and applies that distinction without apology. He listened to Clara's account with the attention of a man who is actually listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. "Victor Hale," he said when she finished. "You know the name?" Ethan said. "I know it tangentially," Ardell said. "Land transactions in the eastern part of the state. Some disputes over water rights that got resolved in ways that didn't entirely make sense to the people on the losing side." He tapped his pen on the desk. "Nothing I can act on based on what happened in Pennsylvania. That's outside my jurisdiction, and there's an official finding on record." "I know," Clara said. "What I can act on," he said, "is a man coming onto private property in my county and pressuring someone to sign a legal document." He looked at her steadily. "He threatened you?" "He implied consequences if I didn't sign," Clara said. "He didn't make a direct threat. He's too careful for that." Ardell nodded slowly. "Careful men make mistakes when they're close to something they want badly enough." He set the pen down. "I'm not going to tell you I can solve what happened in Pennsylvania, Miss Whitmore. I can't. But I can make it known that you have people in this county who are paying attention, and that anyone who comes here looking to intimidate witnesses is going to find that harder than they anticipated." He looked at Ethan. "This is your ranch she's staying at?" "It is," Ethan said. "All right," Ardell said. "You see this man again, you come directly to me. Don't engage, don't negotiate, come straight here." They drove back to the ranch in the gray afternoon light. Clara looked at the landscape moving past her, the dry hills, the sage, the occasional dark shape of a hawk working the updrafts, and thought about the difference between being believed and having someone willing to act. She had been believed before. She had been told she was right, that the fire was suspicious, that Victor Hale was not what he appeared. She had been believed by 3 different people at different times, and none of them had done anything with it. Ardell might not either. She knew that. But he had used the word witnesses, plural, and that was something. Victor Hale did not come back that week, or the week after. Clara watched the road and taught Lily, and made meals, and mended things, and split firewood on the afternoons when Ethan was at the back of the property and she had time and the axe was available. She split wood badly at first. Her aim was off, and she wasted effort. And then with improving accuracy, because she was stubborn about learning things and unwilling to stop until she understood them. Lily found her at it one afternoon and stood watching with her arms crossed. "Papa says women don't usually split wood," Lily said. "Papa splits wood better than I do," Clara said, bringing the axe down. The log split clean. "But I'm here, and he's not, so—" Lily watched for another minute. "Can I try?" "When you're older?" "You always say that." "Because it's always true," Clara said. She was sharpening the axe on the stone outside the barn when Ruth Hadley came by unannounced on a Thursday evening, which was unusual enough to mean something. Ruth came in and sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone assembling information in the right order. "There's a man staying at the hotel," she said. "Came in last week. Victor Hale. He's been talking to people." Clara set her cup down. "He's been asking questions about Ethan's property," Ruth said, "about the water rights on the east side, and about you." She looked at Clara without any cushioning in her expression. "He told Gus Mercer at the feed store that you're his fiancée, that you had some kind of breakdown after a family tragedy, and that he's come to bring you home." The room was very quiet. "He said that," Clara said. "Word for word, near as Gus could remember it." Ruth watched her carefully. "Now, Gus isn't a clever man, but he's not a malicious one. He came and told me because he knows I know you, and he thought something felt wrong about the telling." Clara stood up and walked to the window and looked at the yard. It was almost dark, the last of the daylight going thin at the edges of the hills. Inside, the lamp made its circle and the fire ticked in the stove. He was building a narrative. That was what he was doing, If she went to the authorities again with accusations, he now had a counterstory ready. Grieving woman, unstable, making claims that her concerned fiancé had come to help her see past. He was patient, and he was methodical, and he had done this before, she was certain, to people who had fewer resources than she did, and no one to come home to afterward. She heard Ethan's boots on the back steps and turned from the window. He came in, read the room in the way he had of reading rooms, and looked at Ruth. "Tell me," he said. Ruth told him. Ethan sat down slowly. He looked at the table for a moment. When he looked up, his expression was not angry in the way of a man who has been offended. It was something more deliberate than anger, something that had taken the anger and compressed it into something more useful. "He's calling himself her fiancé," he said. "Yes," Ruth said, "and asking about the water rights." "Yes." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Dale Fitch has been after those water rights for 2 years," he said. "He's offered 3 times. I've turned him down 3 times. He looked at Clara. "Hale said there's a buyer for your family's land. Is it possible the buyer and Fitch are connected?" Clara looked at him. She hadn't made that connection, and the moment he said it, she understood why she should have. "The land in Claremont has a creek running through the eastern portion," she said slowly. "My father always said it was the most valuable part of the property, which is why he never sold it, even when times were hard. Victor wanted it because of the water access. If Fitch is trying to consolidate water rights across this part of the state, then Hale and Fitch might be working the same scheme in different places," Ethan said. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. "I need to write to someone in Claremont," Claire said. "There was a man, an attorney named Herschel Briggs. He told me he believed me, but said without documentation he couldn't bring a case. He might know if Hale and Fitch have any recorded connection." "Write the letter tonight," Ethan said. "I'll take it to town first thing." Ruth finished her coffee and stood. "I'll keep my ears open," she said. "Gus isn't the only person Hale's been talking to. Small towns talk back." She left, and the house felt quieter without her, but not empty. Clara sat at the table and wrote the letter to Herschel Briggs in Claremont, Pennsylvania, and wrote it carefully, the way she had written her letters to Walter Crane, measured, precise, keeping the emotion out of the sentences so the information could be clearly seen. She told him where she was and why. She told him about Victor Hale's arrival and the statement he wanted her to sign, and the name Dale Fitch and the water rights. She asked him if he had any documentation of connection between Hale and Fitch or any record of Hale's land transactions in Nevada, to send it as quickly as he could. She sealed the letter and set it by the door. Ethan was still at the table when she came back to put the lamp out. He had the ledger open but wasn't writing in it. "You should have told me sooner," he said, "about Hale. Before he showed up." Clara looked at him. "I thought he might not find me." "You knew he would eventually." "Yes," she said quietly. "I knew." He closed the ledger. "Why didn't you tell me?" She considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and decided he deserved the complication. "Because I've spent 2 years being someone other people felt sorry for," she said. "And I wanted one place where I was just the person I actually am, without the story following me. Without someone looking at me and seeing the woman with the dead family and the man who burned them out." She paused. "Once you know the story, it's all you see." Ethan looked at her steadily. "I see you working from before sunup," he said. "I see you teaching my daughter things that are going to matter to her for the rest of her life. I see you splitting wood badly, but improving." The corner of his mouth moved. "The story's not all I'd see." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Get some sleep," he said, not unkindly. "We'll deal with what comes." She went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her. The wind was low tonight, just present enough to be audible. Somewhere in the hills, an animal called and was silent. She thought about Margaret Carter's list in her neat handwriting, and Lily asking about dead people and words, and Ethan saying the story's not all I'd see, and she held all of it carefully, the way you hold things that are not yet finished being what they are. She had almost fallen asleep when she heard the horse. Not a wagon, a single horse, moving at a walk and then stopping. In the yard. She was at the window in seconds. The night was clear, a 3/4 moon giving enough light to see by, and in the yard below she could see the gray horse, and on it, Victor Hale. He wasn't moving toward the house. He was just sitting there, in the yard, in the dark, looking at it. She watched him, and he sat there for perhaps 2 minutes, which is a very long time when you are watching someone you are frightened of do something that has no clear interpretation. Then he turned the horse and walked it back down the road. Clara stood at the window long after the sound of hoofbeats had gone. She understood now what that was. It was not an accident, and it was not coincidence. It was a message, delivered without words. I know where you are. I know where you sleep. I can come at any time. She dressed in the dark and went down the stairs and knocked on Ethan's door. He opened it quickly, which meant he had not been fully asleep. Hale was in the yard, she said, just now. He sat there for a few minutes and left. Ethan was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then he reached for his coat hanging by the door. I'm going to sleep downstairs, he said, on the settee, with the rifle. You don't have to. I know I don't, he said. He looked at her in the dark hallway with an expression that was not dramatic and not complicated. Go back to bed, Clara. She went back to bed. She lay there and listened to the sounds of the house and the night, and after a while she heard Ethan settling on the settee downstairs, and the specific quality of the silence changed. It became the silence of a house that has someone awake and watching in it, rather than the silence of a house that is simply waiting. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. 3 days passed without incident, and then 4. Ethan went to town on Friday for supplies and came back with word that Hale was still at the hotel and had been seen twice in conversation with Dale Fitch, which confirmed what they had suspected and made it worse at the same time, because now it wasn't a theory. Clara received a reply from Herschel Briggs faster than she had any right to expect. He had written back by return post, which meant he had been waiting for something like this. The letter was 4 pages long and contained 2 critical pieces of information. First, that Victor Hale had filed a deed transfer claim on her family's Claremont property 3 months after the fire, and while it was being contested by a distant cousin who had some documentation, it was proceeding through the courts slowly. And second, that Briggs had found recorded correspondence between Hale and a land development company incorporated in Nevada under a different name. But the company's registered agent was Dale Fitch. There it is, Ethan said, reading the letter at the kitchen table. It's civil documentation, Clara said, not criminal. Briggs says it doesn't prove the fire. It just proves they have a business relationship. It's enough to take to Ardell, Ethan said. They took it to Ardell the following morning. He read the letter and the documentation Briggs had copied and enclosed, and he was quiet for a long while after. This is enough for me to make some inquiries of my own, he said carefully. I can contact the land office and the territorial court in Carson City. I can request documentation on the Fitch Company's transactions in this county. That's within my authority. He paused. What I'd want you to do is stay close to the ranch. Don't give Hale an opportunity to get you somewhere without witnesses. He's already been in my yard at night, Clara said. Ardell looked at her sharply. When? She told him about the gray horse, the 2 minutes in the yard, the message without words. Ardell's expression shifted into something harder. That's intimidation, he said, that I can work with. He stood and put on his hat. I'm going to go have a conversation with Mr. Hale. They drove back to the ranch. The afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of Nevada afternoon that is beautiful in the way of things that have no interest in whether you appreciate them. Clara looked at the hills and thought about the letter from Briggs and the Fitch Company and the long, careful architecture of what Victor Hale had been building across 2 states, and perhaps more. She thought about her mother and her brother, and the fire, and the cold floor of the station platform in Harlow Creek, and Lily holding out the storybook. She thought about how much of her life in the past 2 years had been about surviving, and how different that was from actually living, and how strange it was that the place she had finally been able to feel the difference was a broken-benched ranch in Nevada that she had arrived at by accident and rejection. She was thinking all of this when they came around the last bend in the road before the ranch and saw the smoke. Not cooking smoke, not chimney smoke. The black, thick, greedy smoke of something burning that was not meant to burn, rising from the direction of the barn. Ethan snapped the reins before she could speak. She grabbed the side of the wagon as it lurched forward, her eyes fixed on the smoke, and felt something drop through her like cold water. The recognition, the bone-deep recognition, of what this was and what it meant and who had done it. She had seen this smoke before. She had been 14 years old, and she had stood in a field and watched it rise and not understood for several seconds what it was eating. She understood now. "Lily," she said. "She's at Ruth's," Ethan said, his voice very controlled. "She's at Ruth's." The barn was fully involved by the time they reached the yard, the fire moving through the dry wood with a speed that left no ambiguity about where it had started or whether it was accidental. Ethan went for the water pump, and Clara went for the fence gate because there were 2 horses in the paddock adjacent, and they were wild-eyed and plunging at the fence, and if the fire jumped the fence line, they would be trapped. She got the gate open, and the horses went through it and out into the open field, and she turned back to find Ethan working the pump with everything he had. But the barn was gone. It was already gone. The structure was a frame of fire, and it was all about keeping it from the house now. She helped him. She didn't think about her hands or the heat or the fact that she was in the smoke and could barely see. She worked the water and they worked the line between the barn and the house, and they kept it wet, and the wind, for once, did not make things worse, held steady in a direction that pushed the fire away from the house rather than toward it. It was nearly an hour before it was clearly contained. They stood in the yard, both of them, breathing smoke and looking at what was left of the barn. The structure was gone. The tools, the feed, the equipment. She didn't know what was salvageable and suspected most of it wasn't. The horses were somewhere in the dark fields. Ethan stood with his hands at his sides and looked at it. Clara stood beside him and looked at it with him. "Same man," she said. "Same man," he said. His voice was very quiet. She had heard voices like that before. The voice of someone who has compressed their anger down to a point small and hard as a stone. A compression that makes the thing more, rather than less dangerous. "Where is he?" Clara said. "I don't know," Ethan said, "but he wants you to run." She looked at the burned-out barn and thought about the train platform and Walter Crane's turn back and the cold and Lily's voice asking if she could read a story and the 6 weeks of meals and lessons and firewood and Ruth's preserved peaches and the letter from Briggs in her pocket, and everything that had been slowly, carefully, imperfectly built in this place. "I'm not running," she said. Ethan turned and looked at her. "I'm done running," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and in the dark and the smoke and the ruin of the barn that Victor Hale had taken from them, something settled between them. Not romantic, not yet anything that had a name, just the specific weight of 2 people standing in the same damage and deciding together that they will not be moved. "All right," he said. He turned back toward the house. "I'm going to get the rifle," he said, "and then I'm going to go find where he is." "No," Clara said. He stopped. "We go to Ardell," she said. "Tonight. Now. Not because I'm afraid of what you'll do to him. Because I want what happens to him to stick. I want it on record. I want it done in the open where it can't be made to disappear." She looked at him steadily. "If you go after him alone in the dark, it becomes your word against his. He knows how to work that. He's been working it for years." Ethan stood still for a long moment. "We do it right," Claire said. "We do it so it holds." She could see him working through it, the anger and the logic pulling against each other, and she watched him make the decision, not the easy one, not the satisfying one, the right one. "Get in the wagon," he said. The road to Harlow Creek at night was a different thing entirely from the road in daylight. The moonlight flattened everything, turned the sage into dark shapes, and the ruts in the road into shadow lines, and Ethan drove fast but not recklessly, with the focused control of a man who knows the road well enough to trust his hands on it in the dark. Clara sat beside him and held the side of the wagon and did not speak. There was nothing to say that would be useful yet, and she had learned that Ethan Carter did not need words to fill silence, that he was, in fact, one of the few people she had met who understood silence as a thing with its own purpose rather than a problem to be solved. She thought about the barn, about the specific smell of it, which she recognized from 14 years ago and had hoped never to encounter again. Burning wood is burning wood, but a barn has its own particular note: the hay, the feed, the leather of the tack. And her body had cataloged that smell when she was a girl watching her family's house go up, and it had not forgotten. Victor Hale was counting on that. He was counting on the memory being more powerful than the resolve, on her recognizing the signature of what he did and breaking before he had to do anything worse. He had miscalculated. Not because she wasn't frightened, she was. But she had learned something in the past 2 years that Victor Hale, with all his patience and methodology and careful narrative building, had not accounted for. The difference between a person who has nothing to lose and a person who has something worth protecting is not the size of their fear. It is what they do with it. Ardell's office was lit when they pulled up, which meant either he was working late or someone had already reached him. The latter, as it turned out. Ruth Hadley's son-in-law, who lived a half-mile south of the Carter Ranch, had seen the smoke and ridden straight into town. Ardell was in his coat when they came through the door. "The barn," Ethan said. "I know," Ardell said. "Sit down, both of you." "I don't want to sit down," Ethan said. "I know that too," Ardell said. "Sit down anyway." Ethan sat. Clara sat beside him. Ardell poured water from a pitcher on the desk and set it in front of them, and sat down himself and looked at them both with the careful look of a man assembling a sequence. "I went to see Hale this afternoon," he said. "Like I told you I would. He wasn't at the hotel." Clara looked at him. "Checked out this morning," Ardell said. "Before I went. Took his horse and his bags, and the desk clerk said he left a note, but the clerk can't read and threw it out." He paused. "I put word out to the deputy to watch the roads. We didn't catch him going anywhere specific." "He burned the barn," Ethan said. "Almost certainly," Ardell said. "And I want to be able to prove that." He looked at Clara. "When was the last time you saw him?" "The day he came to the ranch," she said. 6 days ago. After that, the night he was in the yard on his horse. I didn't see his face clearly that night." "Could you identify the horse?" "Gray, tall, good conformation, white sock on the left foreleg. It was a good horse, better than most men like him actually ride. It was the kind of horse you buy when you want people to see you arrive." Ardell wrote that down. "Anything else you remember about him from the first visit? Details, specifics? Anything he said about where he was staying before he arrived here? How long he'd been in the area?" Clara thought. "He said he'd been looking for me for 2 years. He said he came a long way. He didn't say where he'd stayed in Reno. He mentioned the land transaction in Claremont. He said they were close to completing it, which means there's a buyer with money already committed. If the transaction is close, he'll want to move quickly. He can't afford for documentation to surface that complicates the deed claim." "Which is why he came now," Ardell said. "The timing." "Yes." Ardell looked at the letter from Briggs, which Clara had brought with her, which she had been carrying in her coat pocket since the morning they'd received it. He read it again, more slowly this time. "The connection between Hale and Fitch's company," he said. "This is recorded in Pennsylvania?" "Briggs says it is. He says he has the correspondence and the incorporation documents showing Fitch as registered agent." "I'm going to wire the Territorial Land Office in Carson City tonight," Ardell said. "And I'm going to wire a colleague of mine in Reno who works with the Federal Land Commissioner's Office. Water rights disputes that cross county and territorial lines are federal jurisdiction if there's evidence of coordinated fraud." He set the letter down. "This isn't just your family's land anymore, Miss Whitmore. If Hale and Fitch have been running this scheme across multiple properties, buying out or burning out landowners to consolidate water access, that's a pattern. Patterns are something federal men get interested in." Clara looked at him. She had not, until that moment, considered that the thing Victor Hale had done to her family might be the same thing he had done before and after, to other people in other places who also had no documentation and no one to stand beside them. It changed the shape of everything. "How long will it take?" Ethan said. "The wires go tonight," Ardell said. "Responses? A few days? Maybe less if my contact in Reno moves fast." He paused. "In the meantime, Hale is somewhere in this county, and he's dangerous. I want you both to be careful about where you go alone." He looked at Ethan. "Is the house secure?" "More secure than the barn was," Ethan said, and there was something in his voice that was dry without being humorous. Ardell nodded. "Go home. I'll come to you when I hear something." They drove back in the same silence, but it was a different silence from the one going in. On the way to town, the silence had been about anger held under pressure. On the way back, it was about waiting, which is its own kind of difficult. The barn was still showing a faint glow against the dark sky when they came over the last rise. Embers, not flame. The fire having eaten everything it could find. In the east field, Clara could make out the pale shapes of the horses standing together at the far fence line. Ethan stopped the wagon in the yard and looked at where the barn had been. "My father built that barn," he said. "Took him and 2 neighbors 3 weeks." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't inadequate. "The horses are all right," he said after a moment. He said it like a man finding the thing he can hold on to. "The horses are all right," she said. They got down from the wagon. Ethan went to check the fence line around the house and the remaining outbuildings, carrying the rifle with the ease of a man who is not performing caution, but actually being it. Clara went inside and built the fire up and put water on and stood in the kitchen and looked at the room. The house smelled of smoke. It would smell of smoke for days. She had lived in a place that smelled of smoke once before, and she had left it because every breath was a reminder of what she'd lost. She stood in this kitchen and breathed the smoke and decided deliberately that it meant something different here. Not loss. Evidence. Evidence that something had been attacked and had not fallen. She made coffee and sat down at the table and waited. Ethan came in 20 minutes later and hung up the rifle and sat across from her and took the cup she pushed toward him. The lamp between them lit the lower half of his face and left his eyes in shadow. He looked tired, not the physical tired of hard work, but the particular tiredness of a person carrying more than their share for longer than they intended to. "I need to get Lily in the morning," he said. "Ruth will keep her tonight, but I don't want her to hear about the barn from someone other than me." "I'll come with you," Clara said. He looked at her across the lamp. "You don't—" "I'll come with you," she said again, and he heard, apparently, what she meant by the repetition, which was, "I am not separating from this. I am not letting this be your problem because it came with me. I am in it." He nodded. She slept a few hours, badly, waking twice at sounds that turned out to be wind. Ethan, she suspected, barely slept at all. She heard him moving in the house once in the deep hours of the night, the quiet, deliberate movement of someone checking that the doors are locked and the windows are latched. In the morning, they drove to Ruth Hadley's. Ruth met them at the door with the expression of a woman who has already been told and has spent the night deciding how to help. Behind her, in the front room, Lily was sitting at a table with a piece of paper and a pencil, copying out the letters Claire had written for her. She could see from the doorway the careful practiced shapes of them. "She doesn't know yet," Ruth said quietly to Ethan. "I told her there was a problem at the ranch and you'd come for her in the morning." "Thank you," Ethan said. Lily heard his voice and appeared in the doorway and looked at him, and then at Clara, and then at both of them together, with the rapid reading of situations that children who have experienced loss develop early. "What happened?" she said. "Come here," Ethan said. He sat down on the bench inside Ruth's front door, and Lily came and stood in front of him, and he told her about the barn, plainly, without softening it so much that the shape was lost. He told her no one was hurt. He told her the horses were fine. He told her the house was standing. He told her they were working to find out who had done it. Lily listened with her arms crossed, in the posture she took on when she was bracing for something. "Was it the man?" she said. "The one who came to our yard." Ethan looked at her. "You saw him?" "I woke up," she said. "I looked out the window. I saw a man on a gray horse sitting in the yard." She looked at Clara. "I was going to come get you, but then he left." "Why didn't you say anything?" Clara said. Lily was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't want you to be scared," she said. "And then I thought maybe I dreamed it." Clara looked at this child who had lost her mother and was worried about frightening the adults around her, who saw a man in the yard at night and said nothing because she was trying to protect someone else, and felt something move through her chest that had the force of something structural. "You didn't dream it," Clara said, "and I need you to tell me exactly what you saw." Lily told her. The gray horse, the white sock on the left foreleg, the man's coat, the direction he'd come from. She had been watching from the upper window for perhaps 5 minutes, she thought, before he rode away. "That's important information," Clara said. "You did the right thing by telling us." "I should have told you sooner," Lily said. "You told us now," Clara said. "That's what matters." Ruth Hadley, who had been standing in the doorway to the kitchen listening to all of this, said, "I'll get the girl's coat," and disappeared. She came back with the coat and a wrapped package that turned out to be a ham, which she pressed on Ethan with a no-argument expression. "You'll need to eat," she said, "and I imagine the next few days are going to be busy." They drove back to the ranch. Lily sat between them and held the storybook she'd brought with her to Ruth's, and after a while she reached over and put her hand on Clara's arm. Not asking for anything, not saying anything, just placing her hand there with the direct simplicity of a child who has decided that proximity is the thing she has to offer. Clara put her hand over Lily's, and they rode the rest of the way like that, the three of them, with the ruined barn ahead of them, and the morning opening up cold and clear over the hills. Dale Fitch came to the ranch that afternoon. Clara saw him from the window, the same well-maintained coat from before, the same bearing of a man who expects to be the most important person present. But there was something different in it today. The last time he had come with the patience of a man playing a long game. Today he had the energy of someone whose schedule has been disrupted. Ethan met him in the yard. Clara stayed at the window and watched, and this time she could hear fragments, the voices carrying in the cold, still air. She heard Fitch say unfortunate incident, and she heard Ethan say something she couldn't make out, and she heard Fitch say offer stands, and then she heard Ethan's voice go quieter, which she had learned was not a sign of retreat, but of the opposite. Fitch left in 10 minutes, less time than his previous visit. He did not look toward the house when he left, which was, Clara thought, in itself a kind of information. Ethan came inside. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with his hands flat on the table. He came to offer condolences about the barn, he said, and to mention that his offer for the property is still available, and that given his word was vulnerability, of the ranch right now, perhaps this was a good time to reconsider. He used the word vulnerability, Clara said. He did. They looked at each other. He knew about the barn, Clara said. He came today. Not tomorrow. Not when word might have spread naturally. Today. This morning. Ethan's jaw tightened. Yes. He knew because Hale told him, Clara said, which means Hale was in contact with him after it happened, which means Hale hasn't left the county. Ethan was already moving toward his coat. Ardell, Clara said. He stopped, looked at her. Ardell, she said again. Not you alone. A long pause. He's here somewhere, Ethan said. He burned my barn, and he's still here. I know, she said. And if you go after him alone, Fitch's lawyers will spend the next 6 months making it about what you did rather than what they did. Let Ardell do his job. She could see it cost him. The staying, the patience, the choosing of the right action over the satisfying one. She had felt that cost herself, and she did not minimize it. I'll ride in and tell him about Fitch's visit, Ethan said finally. Good, she said. I'll stay here with Lily. He was gone 2 hours. They were the longest 2 hours Clara had spent since arriving in Nevada, longer in some ways than the night of the fire, because then there had been something to do. Now there was only the waiting, and Lily at the table doing her letters with a concentration that Clara suspected was partly genuine and partly the child's way of creating normalcy through routine, the same way Clara herself had done laundry the afternoon after Victor Hale's first visit. She taught. She sat at the table and they worked through sounding, and Lily's reading was improving in the visible daily way that children's skills improve when someone is paying consistent attention to them. Lily read 3 sentences in a row from the primer, slowly, without help, and looked up with an expression that was trying not to be too proud of itself. You read that, Clara said. I did, Lily said. Then, don't make a big thing of it. I'm not making a big thing of it, Clara said. I'm making an accurate thing of it. Lily looked down at the page and suppressed a smile. Ardell arrived at the ranch before Ethan came back, which Clara did not expect. He came with his deputy, a younger man named Colson, who had the look of someone who works hard to appear unimpressed by things that impress him. They had found Victor Hale, not in Harlow Creek, 7 miles east at an abandoned mining claim that had been vacant for 3 years and belonged, on paper, to a company registered in California, a company that Ardell's contact in Reno had found, in the past 12 hours, was connected to the same network of shell entities as the Fitch Land Company. He was there with a second man, Ardell said. He was standing in Clara's kitchen with his hat in his hands, We don't know the second man yet. Hale saw us coming. He'd been watching the road, and they split up. Coulson went after the second man and lost him in the canyon. He paused. Hale is in custody. Clara sat down. He's in custody, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. 2 years of running and not running and trying to remember what it felt like to be somewhere safe. And the sentence was 4 words, and it sat in the room with its considerable weight. What happens now? She said. Now I wire the federal land commissioner, Ardell said. Your letter from Briggs combined with the company connections I found and the arson charge, because that's what the barn is, it's arson and I'll prove it, is enough to open a federal investigation into the land fraud operation. He looked at her carefully. Your family's property in Claremont, the deed transfer Hale filed, that gets contested as part of a fraud case, it doesn't just vanish, but it becomes something Briggs can fight from a much stronger position. And Fitch, Clara said. Fitch is smarter than Hale, Ardell said. He'll have lawyers between himself and the worst of it. But the connection is documented, and documented connections have a way of pulling at things. He paused. I won't promise you a clean outcome. Law doesn't work that way. But what I can tell you is that it's no longer a single woman's testimony against a man with 30 years of community standing. It's a documented pattern across 2 states with physical evidence and a federal agency asking questions. When Ethan came back and found Ardell in his kitchen, he stopped in the doorway and read the room. Hale, he said. In custody, Ardell said. Ethan took his hat off, held it in his hands. He didn't say anything for a moment, and Clara watched his face go through something complicated. Relief and anger still present. The anger looking for somewhere to go now that its target was unavailable, and underneath all of it, something that was simply exhaustion, the deep physical and emotional exhaustion of a man who has been holding himself at readiness for too long. He put his hat back on and shook Ardell's hand. Thank you, he said. It came out more worn than he probably intended. Miss Whitmore did the work, Ardell said. I just followed the paper. Ardell and Coulson left as the light was going. Ethan stood on the porch and watched their horses down the road, and Clara came and stood beside him. The sky in the west was doing something extraordinary with color, the kind of Nevada sunset that is almost aggressively beautiful in its excess, all the oranges and pinks laid on with too much generosity against the dark shapes of the hills. Neither of them said anything about the sky. The horses came back to the north fence line, Ethan said finally. I saw them this morning. I'll bring them in tomorrow. The fence along the east pasture needs mending, Clara said. 3 posts that I've been meaning to mention. I know, he said. I've been putting it off. We can do it Thursday if the weather holds. He glanced at her sideways. You and your we, he said. She looked at him. Is that a complaint? No, he said quietly. It's not. They stood on the porch a moment longer, in the cold, with the sunset doing what it was doing and the ruined barn to the left of them, the black skeleton of it against the colored sky. It was there and it was real, and it would need to be cleared and rebuilt, and that was a large and expensive and laborious thing, and it did not go away just because Victor Hale was in a cell in Harlow Creek. Nothing went away. The harm that had been done was still done, and the process that was starting would take time, and Hale's lawyers would work and Fitch's lawyers would work, and the federal men would move at the pace federal men move, and the deed to Clara's family's land was still tangled in a Pennsylvania court and might be for a year or more. But she was standing on a porch, not a train platform, not the cold floor of a house where her family had been. A porch, belonging to a house that was lit from inside, where a child was at a table reading sentences she had put together herself from letters she had been given. She was standing there and she was not leaving. Inside, Lily's voice rose with a question, something about supper, about whether there were biscuits, about something a child asks when they believe the people around them will answer. And the sound of it came through the door into the cold evening air, ordinary and present and real. Ethan turned toward the door. I'll get the fire up, he said. I'll start supper, Clara said. They went inside. That night, after Lily was asleep and the dishes were done and the fire had settled into its later, quieter burn, Ethan sat at the table with the ledger again. Clara was mending a pair of Lily's stockings, the needle moving in and out with the small, precise motion of someone who has done this enough times that it doesn't require much thought. "I want to ask you something," Ethan said. She looked up. He had closed the ledger, but his hands were still on it. The posture of a man who has rehearsed what he wants to say and is deciding whether the rehearsed version is actually what he means. "You could have left," he said, "after Hale showed up. You had reason. Any reasonable person would have put distance between themselves in that situation and figured out the rest later." He paused. "Why didn't you?" Clara set the stocking down and thought about the honest answer. "Because leaving would have meant losing this," she said, gesturing at nothing specific, at the room, at the lamp, at the sound of the fire. "And I've lost enough." He looked at her for a moment. "That's it?" "That's most of it," she said. He was quiet. "What's the rest of it?" She picked up the stocking again. "The rest of it I'm not ready to say out loud yet," she said, "but you can probably guess." She did not look up from the mending. She could feel him looking at her, and then feel the precise moment when he decided not to press it. "All right," he said. He opened the ledger again. The fire ticked. The needle moved in and out of the fabric. Outside, the Nevada dark was cold and immense and entirely uninterested in the small, bright room inside the house. But the room was there anyway, lit and warm, holding what it held. A week after Hale's arrest, a letter came from Herschel Briggs. He had been contacted by the Federal Land Commissioner's office. The Claremont deed transfer had been suspended pending investigation. The distant cousins contest of the claim had been folded into the federal case, which meant it had resources and standing it had not previously had. Briggs wrote, "I believe we have a reasonable path forward. It will take time, but I believe we have it." Clara read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen counter, and then folded it and put it with the other papers she had begun keeping in a careful order in the small box she had designated for the purpose. Documentation, evidence, the physical record of what had happened and what was being done about it. She thought about her mother, who had kept the deed to that land in a tin box under the floorboard of the kitchen because she said, "You never knew when you'd need to prove what was yours." The tin box had burned, but the deed had been recorded at the county seat, which was why there was a deed transfer to contest, which was why Briggs had a case. Her mother had been more careful than she knew. Clara put the letter in the box and closed it and went to find Lily for the morning's lesson. 3 weeks after the arrest, the first neighbor came. He was a man named Dooley, who ran a small cattle operation 4 miles to the north, and he came with a wagon load of lumber. He pulled into the yard and climbed down and took his hat off and said to Ethan, "I heard about the barn." And Ethan said, "Word gets around." And Dooley said, "Me and some others thought we'd come Saturday. If you have the foundation cleared." "I'll have it cleared," Ethan said. Saturday came, and so did the others. Ruth Hadley's son-in-law, and a family named Pierce from the South Road, and the man who ran the grain merchants in Harlow Creek, and 2 others whose names Clara learned over the course of the day. They came with tools and with their own hands and with the matter-of-fact generosity of frontier people who understand that a neighbor's loss is a shared vulnerability and that the answer to it is practical. They worked from first light until the sun was going. Clara cooked enormous quantities of food, more than she had cooked since she left Pennsylvania, using Ruth's ham and the provisions people brought with them, and her own best judgment about what feeds a group of working people on a cold November day. Lily helped without being asked, with the proud seriousness of a child who has identified something she can do and is doing it. By the end of the day, the frame of the new barn was standing. It was not the barn Ethan's father had built. It was rawer, the lumber newer, the dimensions slightly different because the materials available were not quite the same, but it was standing, and in the last light it cast the particular long shadow of a structure with intentions. Ethan shook hands with every man who came. When the last wagon had pulled out, he stood in the yard and looked at the frame, and Clara came and stood beside him again, the same spot they had stood 3 weeks earlier looking at the ruins. "Community," she said. "Yeah," he said. "You have one," she said. "I don't know if you knew that." He looked sideways at her. "I knew," he said. "I'd just been too inside my own head to use it for a while." She understood that. She had spent 2 years inside her own head. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the barn frame, not at her, which she thought was probably how he needed to do this. "I was thinking," he said, "that housekeeper is not, that is to say, I was wondering if we might consider a different—" He stopped, started over. "This isn't coming out right." "It's coming out fine," she said. He looked at her then. "I'm not going anywhere," she said simply. "If that's what you're trying to get to." Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, but relief. And underneath the relief, something that had been closed for a long time and was tentatively opening. He was not a man who showed things easily. She was not a woman who accepted them easily, but they were both, she thought, people who had learned that the things worth having were usually also the things that required you to be honest about wanting them. "I have a property to rebuild," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll help." "I have a daughter who is reading actual sentences." "She'll be reading books by spring," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want you here because I need a housekeeper," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I'm clear about it," she said. The barn frame stood in the cold last light, and neither of them moved for a moment. Standing in the yard of a property that had been attacked and had not given way, beside a house that had been cold and was warm again, in a place that had started as a last resort and had become, gradually and imperfectly and without announcement, something else entirely. Clara looked at the frame and thought, this is how things get built. Not all at once, not cleanly, piece by piece, with other people's hands, in the cold, on ground that somebody tried to take from you. She thought, you stay. That's the whole of it. You decide to stay, and then you do the work, and then one day you look up, and what you've built is real. The wind came off the hills and moved through the unfinished walls of the new barn and made it sound there, the sound of air moving through an incomplete structure, not yet sealed against the weather. They had time for that. Winter came to the Carter Ranch the way winter comes to that part of Nevada. Not gradually, not with warning, but with the blunt decisiveness of something that has been waiting its turn and is now done waiting. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in a single night in late November, and by morning the water in the trough had a skin of ice, and the breath of the horses in the east pasture made small clouds in the still air. Clara woke early, as she had gotten into the habit of doing, and built the kitchen fire up before anyone else was moving, and stood at the window with her coffee and looked at the frost on the glass and felt, without making too much of the feeling, that she was glad to be inside it. The barn was enclosed now. Not finished. There were details that would wait for spring, interior work, the proper installation of the tackroom shelving. But the walls were up, and the roof was on, and the horses were in it and out of the weather, which was the essential thing. Dooley and his neighbors had come back 2 more Saturdays after the first, and what had been a frame was now a structure, and the structure was holding. She thought about that sometimes, in the early mornings before the house was fully awake. The way a thing gets built out of successive Saturdays and other people's willingness and the decision, made and remade, to keep going. There was nothing heroic in it. That was what she had learned, maybe, more than anything else, that the things that matter are built in the ordinary way, with ordinary materials, by people who are tired and imperfect and showing up anyway. Lily appeared in the kitchen at her usual time, which was 20 minutes after Clara and before her father, and sat down with the particular morning face of a child who is present, but not yet fully operational. Her hair was not yet braided. She had put her boots on without tying them. She accepted the cup of warm milk Clara set in front of her and wrapped both hands around it in an exact replica of the way Ethan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, which was an unconscious echo that Clara had noticed months ago and found, each time she saw it, quietly affecting. "It snowed," Lily said, looking at the window. "Not yet," Clara said, "but it will." Lily looked at the frost patterns on the glass. "What makes those shapes?" "The water in the air freezing against the cold glass," Clara said. "Each one is different, because the temperature varies across the surface and the water finds the path it can take." Lily studied the patterns. "Like how no two are the same." "Like that." "Papa says no 2 snowflakes are the same either." "Papa's right." Lily drank her milk. After a moment, she said, "Is that true, or is it something adults say?" Clara looked at her. It's true. Each snowflake forms around a different particle of dust at a different temperature with a different humidity. The variations are real. Lily considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to information she intended to keep. So every single piece of snow that ever fell was different from every other piece. Yes. Even all the ones no one ever saw. Even those. Lily looked at the frost on the window for a long time. Ethan came down and the morning proceeded in the way their mornings had come to proceed. The quiet, functional routine of people who have learned each other's rhythms and stopped needing to negotiate them. He ate, she poured his coffee, Lily finished her milk and tied her boots finally when reminded, and the day began. December came, and with it, 2 pieces of news. The first came from Ardell, who rode out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with his hat pulled low and his manner carrying the specific quality of a man who has done something he's satisfied with. Victor Hale had been charged formally: arson, intimidation of a witness, and conspiracy to defraud in connection with the federal land investigation. He had been transferred to the territorial court in Carson City, where the federal case was being consolidated. His bail had been set at a figure that assumed someone would pay it, but the someone in question, Dale Fitch, had his own problems. Fitch's company documents came back from Carson City, Ardell said, sitting at the kitchen table. 3 properties in this county alone where the pattern holds. Landowners who had water rights on the eastern drainage sold out within a year of having some kind of pressure applied. 2 of them said they sold because of what they described as unexplained problems: fence lines cut, livestock spooked, one case where a storage building burned and the cause was listed as unknown. Clara sat across from him with her hands flat on the table, and no one connected them. No one was looking for a connection, Ardell said. Each incident on its own looks like bad luck or accident. It's only when you lay them side by side that you see the shape of it. That's what he's always counted on, Clara said, each thing looking like an isolated event. Well, it's not isolated anymore, Ardell said. The federal investigator arrives in Harlow Creek the 2nd week of January. He's going to want a statement from you. Formal, sworn, the complete account of what happened in Claremont and what happened here. I'll give it, Clara said. I know you will, Ardell said. He looked at her with the direct, unvarnished look she had come to associate with him. The look of a man who means what he says and says what he means without ornamentation. For what it's worth, Miss Whitmore, the way you handled this, coming to me with the documentation, not letting Carter go off half-cocked, building the case instead of just reacting, that's the reason we're sitting here with charges filed instead of a mess that can't be cleaned up. Clara shook her head. Briggs built the case. You followed it. I just didn't run. Sometimes that's the whole of it, Ardell said. He left, and Clara sat for a while at the table after he was gone. Not doing anything in particular. Just sitting, the way you sit when something has shifted and you need a moment to feel the new position before you stand up in it. Ethan found her there when he came in from the fence work. He looked at her face and said, "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," she said. "Mostly good." She told him. He listened, and when she was done, he sat down across from her in the chair Ardell had been in and was quiet for a moment. "Fitch," he said. "It's not a conviction," she said. "Not yet. The investigation is just starting. It will take time." "I know." He was looking at the table with the particular look of a man absorbing information that confirms what he suspected and is still somehow surprising in the confirmation. 3 other properties in this county. At least 3, Clara said. They're still looking. He was quiet for another moment. Those families, he said. Yes. They sold and left, he said, or they're still here having sold what made the land worth keeping. Yes. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was not just about Fitch or Hale or water rights, something larger, the particular weight that lands on a person when they understand that what happened to them was not random, was not bad luck, was an engineered thing done by people who thought the engineering would never be visible. If you hadn't come here, he said, if you'd never ended up on that platform, never ended up at the ranch. He stopped. Then Hale would have gotten the statement he wanted, or just waited long enough for the Claremont claim to go through unchallenged, Clara said.
And you would have sold eventually, or he would have found another way to make you. And 3 other families in this county have no one to... He stopped again. Ardell found them, Clara said. Their stories are in the federal case now. It's not nothing. Ethan looked at her steadily. No, he said. It's not nothing. The second piece of December news came from Herschel Briggs, in a letter that arrived on a Thursday when the first snow was actually falling. Small, thin flakes, the tentative opening act of what promised to be a more serious performance later. Briggs wrote that the federal investigation's reach into Pennsylvania had resulted in the Claremont deed transfer being formally suspended. The cousin's claim had been consolidated with Clara's own claim. Briggs had filed on her behalf, asserting her right as surviving primary heir, which she had not known she could do from Nevada, but which Briggs had found a mechanism for through the federal case's procedural reach. The land was not resolved. It would not be resolved for some time. But the transfer Victor Hale had engineered was stopped, and the property was under a legal hold that meant no one could move it until the case was adjudicated. Briggs wrote, at the end of the letter, I want you to understand that this is not over and may not go entirely in your favor. The law rarely gives back what was taken with perfect completeness. But what your mother kept and what your family built is not gone. It is in contest, which is a different thing from being lost. There is a difference between gone and still being fought for. Clara read that paragraph 3 times. She thought about her mother, who had kept the deed in a tin box under the kitchen floor, who had said, you never know when you'll need to prove what's yours, who had said it not with fear but with the practical wisdom of a woman who understood that the world does not simply grant you what is yours, that possession is documented or it is contested, that the paper matters as much as the fact. The tin box had burned, but the deed had been recorded at the county seat in the handwriting of a county clerk who had no stake in the outcome and whose job was simply to write down what was true. Victor Hale had not been able to burn that. Some things, Clara thought, were more fireproof than they looked. She wrote back to Briggs that same evening, a longer letter than her previous ones, giving him the full account of everything she had and everything she knew, organized in the careful way she had organized the papers in the small box, chronologically, with specifics, with nothing omitted and nothing inflated. She wrote it the way she had taught her students to write. Say what is true, say it clearly, say it completely, and then stop. She did not know what the outcome would be. She had learned in 2 years of this not to need to know the outcome in order to act. You did the next right thing. You documented. You did not run. You stayed in the room and in the record, and you kept showing up. That was the thing about surviving something that was designed to make you disappear. The act of not disappearing was itself a form of resistance. The federal investigator, a man named Aldous Webb, arrived in Harlow Creek on the 8th of January, 2 days after the date Ardell had given. He was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps 35, with the organized, detail-oriented manner of someone who approaches everything like a problem with a knowable solution. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning with Ardell, and Clara sat across from him at the kitchen table for 2 hours and gave her statement. She told it plainly. All of it. She had told it enough times now that the emotional texture of it had changed. Not that the events were less, but that the telling of them had become something separate from the living of them, a document she could produce without being demolished by it. She answered his questions precisely. She provided the box of papers, Briggs's letters, the documentation of the company connections, the timeline she had written out, the list of dates and events. Webb looked through the papers with the focused attention of someone for whom paper is the primary language. You organized all of this yourself, he said. Yes, Clara said. When? Over the past 2 months. He looked at her over the papers. Have you worked in a legal context before? I was a school teacher, she said. I taught children that you write down what is true and you keep the record because the record is what survives. Webb was quiet for a moment. The record is what survives, he said, as if testing the weight of it. That's... Yes. He looked back at the papers. I'm going to need copies of several of these documents. I'll have my clerk make them and return the originals to you.
They stay in my possession until then, Clara said. Understood, he said, without hesitation. After Webb and Ardell left, Ethan, who had sat through the interview at the far end of the table and said almost nothing, looked at Clara for a long moment. You were something in there, he said. I was just accurate, she said. Sometimes accurate is something, he said. The winter deepened. The new barn held. The horses were healthy, and Ethan had made arrangements with Dooley to run a small shared herd through the spring, a practical consolidation that made the math work better for both of them. Lily's reading had moved past primers and into an actual book, a thin collection of frontier stories that Ruth Hadley had produced from somewhere, slightly battered, with illustrations that Lily studied as carefully as she studied the text. She read aloud at the supper table sometimes, in the evenings, the way families do when they have found the habit of it. She read slowly and with attention, sounding out the words she didn't know rather than skipping them, in the practice Clara had instilled from the first week. Take the word apart, put it back together, don't be afraid of not knowing it yet. One evening, she read a passage about a woman crossing a river in flood season alone, with all her possessions in a pack on her back. She read it with the engaged seriousness of someone who finds the material genuinely interesting, and when she finished the passage, she looked up. Was she scared? Lily asked. Not of Clara specifically, of the room, of the general available audience. Probably, Clara said. People who do hard things are usually scared. Then why do they do them? Because the alternative is staying on the wrong side of the river, Clara said. Lily thought about this. But what if you drown? Then you drown, Clara said. But most people don't. Most people get across. Lily looked at her father. Did you ever do something like that? Scary? Ethan looked at his daughter across the table. Staying on the ranch after your mother died, he said. That was hard enough. But you stayed, Lily said. I stayed, he said. Because of the alternative, Lily said, with the careful logic of someone applying a framework she has just acquired. Because of you, he said, in a tone that did not invite expansion. Lily looked at this information and filed it in whatever place she kept things that were important and didn't need to be discussed further. She went back to the book. Clara looked at the table, at the lamp, at the two people across from her, and thought about the train platform at Harlow Creek, the broken bench, the cold, the 11 witnesses to her being turned away. She thought about the specific sequence of events that had to happen in exactly the order they happened for her to be sitting in this particular circle of lamplight. The rejection, the platform, the cold, the child with the storybook, the widower with the spare room, and the practical offer and the coffee cup held in both hands. She thought about how any one of those things changed would have meant something else entirely. If Walter Crane had been a different man, or if Lily had been asleep when Clara sat down on the bench, or if the storm had come an hour earlier and the platform had been empty. She did not know what to do with that kind of contingency, the way one life is built from 1,000 small accidents of timing. She did not try to assign it meaning, she just sat with it. Spring arrived, as Nevada springs do, with a sudden shift in the quality of the light before the temperature followed. The quality of the light changed in early March, became longer in the afternoons, warmer in its angle against the hills, and Clara noticed it first from the kitchen window and felt something she recognized as hope. Not the desperate kind, not the kind she'd carried on the train west, but the steady kind, the kind that is just the accurate assessment that the season has turned and things will grow. The federal investigation had been proceeding through the winter. Webb sent periodic correspondence to Ardell, who passed information along. Hale had been indicted on 5 counts, including the Claremont arson, which Briggs had worked with the federal prosecutor to include in the consolidated case. The evidence was substantial. Hale's lawyer was making noise about the witness accounts being unreliable, which was the move Clara had always known he would make. But the documentary evidence, the company connections, the land transfer records, the pattern across properties, was not testimony dependent. It held on its own. Fitch had retained 2 lawyers and was cooperating partially, which in Clara's experience of legal matters meant he was trading information about Hale for protection of himself, and there would be a negotiation about what that protection looked like. Ardell had been direct about this. Fitch might not face criminal charges. He might lose the company registrations and the land claims and be prohibited from certain transactions. He might pay a financial penalty. It was not the same as what Hale would face. Clara had made her peace with that. Not easily and not completely, but practically. Victor Hale, who had burned her family's house and stood in her yard and pressured her to erase the evidence of what he had done. He was looking at years in the territorial prison. That was real. That held. The imperfection of what happened to Fitch was its own kind of injustice, but she had learned that the choice was not between a perfect outcome and an imperfect one. It was between an imperfect outcome and none. She chose the imperfect outcome. She had learned to choose real over ideal. In April, a letter came from Briggs that was different from the others. He wrote that the federal adjudication of the Claremont property had concluded. The Hale deed transfer had been voided. The property had been returned to the estate of her mother and brother, with Clara as the named surviving heir. The cousins' competing claim had been settled with a small payment that Briggs had negotiated out of the federal restitution fund. "The land is yours," Briggs wrote. "What you do with it is entirely your decision. I would be happy to assist with whatever you decide." Clara sat with that letter for a long time. The land. Her mother's kitchen with the tin box under the floor. The garden her brother had planted every spring with the focused, incompetent enthusiasm of a boy who loved the idea of growing things more than he understood the actual practice. The old oak tree at the east edge of the property that her father had said was 100 years old before they arrived and would be 100 more after they were gone. All of it, on paper, hers. She had not been back to Claremont in 2 years. She thought about going back, and the thought had a complicated texture. Not impossible anymore, but full of things she would have to be willing to feel. She told Ethan that evening. He read the letter and handed it back to her. "Congratulations," he said. Quietly, genuinely. "It doesn't feel the way I expected it to," she said. "How does it feel?" She thought. "Like something that happened," she said. "Not like an ending, like a thing that was lost being found, but you've already figured out how to live without it. So the finding doesn't reorganize everything. It just adds to it." He was quiet. "I'm not going back," she said. "Not to live. I want to be clear about that." He looked at her carefully. "What will you do with it?" "Lease it," she said. "There's a family. I remember them from before. The Hart family, 3 sons. They've been tenant farming on the South Road for 20 years. They know the land. They know what the water does in spring and what the soil needs." She paused. "Briggs can arrange it. The income isn't large, but it's something." "It's yours," Ethan said. "You decide." "I've decided," she said. He nodded. Then, after a moment, "Clara." She looked at him. He was doing the thing he had been doing since November, the careful assembling of words for something he had never quite finished saying. She had watched him come close to it several times and retreat into the practical, into the ledger or the fence work or the plain statement of what needed doing next. She had not pushed. She was a person who understood that some things needed their own time. He said, "I want to ask you something that isn't about the house or the land or anything practical." "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not as a housekeeper, as—" He paused. "I want you to stay because this is where you belong, because Lily reads because of you, and because I have not eaten a burned meal in 4 months, and because the house is—" He stopped. "That's still too practical." "A little," she said. He looked at her directly. "I want you to stay because when you're not in the room, I notice it," he said. "And when you are, things are better. Not easier, necessarily. Just better. And I think you know what I mean." She did know what he meant. She had known for some time. "Yes?" she said. He looked at her. "Yes, you know what I mean? Or yes, you'll stay?" "Both," she said. Something happened in his face that was the full version of the almost smile she had been watching for months. Not careful, not measured, just there. He said, "I'm not good at— I want you to know that this is not going to be— I don't know how to say this without it sounding like a warning." "I know you're not easy," she said. I'm not easy either. No, he said. You're really not. We'll manage, she said. I think we will, he said. Lily, who had been in the front room with her book and had apparently been tracking the conversation with the radar of a child who understands more than the adults are accounting for, appeared in the kitchen doorway at this precise moment. She looked at her father and then at Clara and then at her father again. Are you asking her to stay forever? She said. Lily, Ethan said. Because she should, Lily said. She said it simply, without drama, with the declarative confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. She reads the hard words and she doesn't burn anything, and she's not scared of the big things. She paused. I'm not scared of the big things either now, because she's here. Clara looked at this girl, this child who had put her hand on Clara's arm in the wagon without being asked, who had copied the letters on her paper and not told anyone about the man in the yard because she was trying to protect the people she loved, who had asked whether dead people could be heard through the words they left behind. I'm staying, Clara said. Lily nodded once, as if this was the correct and logical conclusion to a line of reasoning she had been running for some time, and went back to her book. Ethan looked at the doorway she'd gone through and then at Clara. She's been managing this whole thing, he said. Since the beginning, Clara said. Summer came to the Carter Ranch in the particular Nevada way, bright and hot and enormous. The sky so blue in the afternoons it looked painted, the sage releasing its dry, resinous smell in the heat, the horses moving slowly in the east pasture in the long evening light. The new barn had been finished in May, properly this time, with the tack room shelves and the proper hayloft and the ventilation that the old barn had never had. Dooley and 2 others had come for that final work, and there had been food and something approaching a celebration in the way of people who celebrate practical completions, with handshakes and shared meals rather than speeches. Clara was there for all of it, and she was not the housekeeper making the food and stepping aside. She was there the way you are there in a place that is yours. She and Ethan had been married in March, a small thing, at the courthouse in Harlow Creek, with Ardell as witness, and Ruth Hadley standing beside Clara in a dress that Ruth had said was going to be worn to this occasion, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. The ceremony was brief. The judge was practical. Lily had worn the winter coat with the proper buttons and stood straight and watched her father sign the paper and then looked at Clara and gave a small nod that carried more weight than most speeches. Afterward, Ruth had made coffee and produced a cake that she said she'd been planning for some time. How long? Ethan had said. Since she fixed the curtains, Ruth said. Anyone who fixes someone else's curtains without being asked is planning to stay. Clara had laughed, which she had been doing more of. Laughter that was not performed and not complicated, just the thing that happens when life is arranged in a way that makes it possible. The investigator Webb came back to Harlow Creek in June for the final depositions before the territorial trial. He came out to the ranch and sat at the same kitchen table and went through Clara's statement one more time, refining the details, confirming the sequence. When he was finished, he closed his notebook and looked at her. I want you to understand something, he said. The pattern we found across this county and 2 others in this territory and the case in Pennsylvania, this would have continued. There were 4 more properties in the survey area that matched the profile. Water rights adjacent to the eastern drainage, single owner or widow-owned, no large legal resources. He paused. Without your documentation, we would not have had the mechanism to see the pattern. Briggs built the documentation, Clara said. You started the chain, Webb said. You kept the records. You came to Ardell instead of handling it privately. Every one of those decisions made the case. He paused. I've done this work for 9 years. Most cases like this don't make it to indictment because the key witness is gone, moved on, settled, scared off, or simply worn down until they stop insisting on the truth. He looked at her steadily. You didn't stop. Clara looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, which she knew by now, had been looking at since January when she arrived and found the dishes not put away and the fire out and a list in careful handwriting waiting for someone to care about it. I had somewhere to be, she said. That made it harder to leave. Victor Hale was convicted in August on 3 of the 5 counts: arson, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to defraud. He received 7 years in the territorial prison. The Claremont arson charge was harder to prosecute at this distance, and with the physical evidence long gone, but the federal judge noted in his sentencing remarks that the pattern of conduct across multiple properties and states had been considered in the determination. 7 years. Clara heard the news from Ardell on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the yard and looked at the hills for a moment. The same hills she had looked at on the first morning from the bedroom window, wondering what the day intended. She had thought maybe that she would feel more, that the number would arrive with a weight that matched the thing it addressed. Instead, it arrived the way most justice arrives, real and insufficient, and also the best that was available, and therefore something to accept and be grateful for without pretending it was everything. She thought about her mother, about her brother, who was 16 and had his whole life in front of him, and had not known, going to bed on the night of the fire, that it was going to be taken. She thought about them with the particular quality of grief that has had 2 years to find its shape, not sharp now, but present, a mass that moves with you, that you learn to move around, that doesn't go away but becomes, over time, something you can carry without being crushed. She thought, they would have liked Lily. Her mother would have sat at the kitchen table and watched Lily work through her letters with the expression of a woman who understands what education means for a girl, what it opens. Her brother would have been 10 years older than Lily and would have taught her to bother the horses and climb fences and understand that the land has moods, and you read them the way you read anything else, with patience and attention. She thought, I am still here. I am still here, and they are not, and that is not fair, and it is also just true, and I can spend the rest of my life sitting with the unfairness of it, or I can do what you do with true things, which is acknowledge them and keep moving. She kept moving. Ethan found her in the yard when he came in from the east pasture and read her face the way he had gotten good at reading her face. Ardell came, he said. Yes, she said. 7 years. He stood beside her and looked at the hills. Is that enough? He said. No, she said. But it's real. He put his hand over hers, the way Lily had put her hand on Clara's arm in the wagon, not asking for anything, not performing comfort, just the weight of another person's hand, the physical fact of not being alone. They stood there for a moment. Then she said, the fence on the north side needs work before winter. I know, he said. Thursday, if the weather holds. I'll help, she said. You always say that, he said. I always mean it, she said. The fall of that year was the most beautiful Clara had seen in Nevada, which she recognized might have something to do with actually looking at it rather than surviving through it. The hills went through their changes, the sage going silvery, and the occasional cottonwood at the creek line turning yellow, and the light in the late afternoons came in at an angle that made even ordinary things, the fence posts, the water trough, the horses in the pasture, look considered and deliberate. Lily turned 9 in October and had a birthday that involved Ruth Hadley's cake and Dooley's family, and a small gathering of the people who had become, over the year, the texture of their lives. She received a proper set of books from Clara, 3 volumes, chosen carefully, each one a step further than the last, and held them with the reverence children hold things they understand are serious gifts. Real books, she said. Real books, Clara confirmed, not primers. Not primers. Lily looked at them for a long moment. Will you read the first chapter of each one with me, she said, so I know how they start? Yes, Clara said. They read that evening, the 3 of them at the table, Clara reading the opening chapters aloud, Lily following the text with her finger, Ethan listening with the look he had when he was listening to something he would not ask to be repeated but wanted to hear once properly. The first book was about a girl who crossed a continent. The second was about a man who built something from nothing in a place that told him he couldn't. The third was about a family that wasn't born together finding its way to being one. Lily listened to all 3 and then said, the third one is our story. Clara looked at the table and the lamp and the child across from her. Ours is better, she said. Lily considered this. Because it's real? Because it's real, Clara said. Here is what she knew in the fall of that year, sitting in the lamplight with the family that had assembled itself around her through accident and choice and the refusal to give up and go somewhere easier.
She knew that the worst moment of her life had been standing on a train platform in the cold, being dismissed in front of strangers by a man who didn't know her and had decided she wasn't worth knowing. She had believed in that moment that it was the end of something. She had been right that it was an ending. She had been wrong about what ended. What ended was the life she had been trying to rebuild in the shape of the one she had lost. The schoolroom in Pennsylvania, the familiar streets, the identity she had known so long she had confused it with herself. Those things were over. Victor Hale had helped end them, and she would not thank him for it, but the ending had happened regardless. What began was something she could not have designed and would not have chosen, and would not now trade for anything she had been trying to get back. She had arrived in Nevada looking for a husband and a fresh start and a version of belonging that looked like what she remembered. She had found, instead, something that looked nothing like what she'd expected, and was more real than anything she'd planned for. A child who said, "I like the hard words." A man who held his coffee cup in both hands. A community that came on Saturdays with lumber and left with the thing more finished than it had been. A sheriff who followed the paper. A lawyer in Pennsylvania who waited for the chain that would let him act. None of it had been clean. None of it had arrived on schedule or in the form she would have specified. The barn had burned. The truth had taken longer than it should have. Justice had come into the imperfect shape that justice usually comes in, partial and real, not everything and still something. She had stayed. That was the whole of her contribution to all of it, when she stripped everything down to the essential. She had stayed. She had not run when Victor Hale showed up with his pleasant face and his carefully constructed story. She had not run when the barn burned. She had not accepted the version of herself that the world kept offering. The poor grieving woman, the rejected bride, the solitary witness with no one to stand beside her, and replaced it with the actual version, which was a woman who had learned to read a room and split wood and keep a record and make biscuits and sit with a child in the dark and stay in a place until it was hers. She had stayed, and staying, it turned out, was not the same as settling. It was not resignation or giving up. It was the choice, made and remade, to put your weight down in the ground beneath you and grow from there. There was a morning in November, almost a year to the day after she had arrived at the ranch, when she woke and the snow was actually falling. The real snow this time, the serious kind, the kind that changes the sound of everything and makes the world quieter and closer all at once. She stood at the window and watched it come down and felt the house around her, Lily still sleeping, Ethan already at the barn, the fire already built because she had woken first and built it. She put her hands against the cold glass and looked at the snow and thought, without any particular destination for the thought, I am home. Not home in the way of a place you were born to, not home in the way of something you were handed, home in the way of something you chose, and kept choosing, and built from the materials you were given in the place where you found yourself standing. She had found herself standing in the cold on a broken benched platform, dismissed and alone, with a child holding out a book. She had said yes. That yes, it turned out, had been the most important word she ever spoke. Not because it was said to the right person, or at the right time, or with any particular courage or clarity. She had said it because she was too cold and too tired and too stubborn to say anything else. But it was yes. And yes again and again in all the ordinary daily forms it takes. Yes to the work, yes to the trouble, yes to the imperfect family and the burned barn and the long cold winter and the documentation and the stain and the hard words and the real things over the easy ones had built, piece by piece and Saturday by Saturday and year by year, a life. Outside, the snow came down on the new barn and the east pasture and the north fence that needed mending and the hills she had learned to read for weather and the road that came into the property from the west and had brought her to it once, on a January night, in the company of a child and a widower who didn't know yet what they were doing. None of them had known. They had found out the way you find out most things that matter, by staying long enough to see. The end.